again. As we prepare for Purim and we determine how we can react or respond to the horrors in Ukraine, we hope that decisive action and intervention will bring the situation to an end and we can begin to rebuild and help the victims heal. Merle and I welcome all of you to our virtual interview with Julie Zuckerman. We appreciate the support and assistance of the staff of Women's League for Conservative Judaism's office. Isabel is facilitating the tech platform for us, and thank you very much. As mentioned earlier, I believe we have participants from Toronto, Canada, from various places in Israel, and many states around our country in the United States. A brief bio of Julie. She grew up in Trumbull, Connecticut, and has rich memories of her experiences and friendships through her participation in USY and attending Camp Ramah. Approximately 20 years ago, her family made Aliyah and settled in Modi'in. That may be blocked together. Julie can maybe clarify if I've misrepresented that. We've learned in talking with her last Sunday, Merle and I, that she's been writing for decades. During her high school years, she edited the Achshav newsletter, which is now a blog for United Synagogue Youth. When she attended college at Columbia University, she was the editor of that institution's newspaper. So writing has been something she's been devoting much time and thought and imagination to. Today, hopefully Julie will tell us a little bit more about her writing process and her book, her first book, I believe. It's a collection of short stories that have focused on a protagonist named Jeremiah Gersler. For those of you who've looked at the book, you will notice that many of these stories have been published in various literary journals in the past interval that she's been writing these stories. As typical, Merle will share our questions. I will be taking notes and share questions that I see popping up in the chat space, which you can be more than thrilled to use. Toward the end, we will entertain some questions. If you can use the reactions section of the Zoom platform to raise your hand. We will also try to scan all of our participants' faces to see if you're waving at us to indicate you would like to chat. I'd also like to thank Julie for being with us across the different time zones. And Merle, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome, Julie, from Israel. And I guess I would just start by jumping right in and ask you if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to Israel from Connecticut and your journey.
Sure. First of all, thank you all so much for being here with me today, or tonight for me. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be speaking to Women's League Reads. It feels like a homecoming of sorts. As Susan mentioned, I grew up in Connecticut and was very involved in USY there. That's actually how I met my husband, was through USY, and always kind of felt like I was on the same path as my friends from Ramah and USY. I went on Ramah seminar, and then I spent a semester in college here. And when I got to Israel for that semester, people started asking me, like, do you want to make Aliyah? And I said, no, I'm just on the path. You know, that's what everybody does. But by the end of my semester in Israel, I was like, oh, I came for my spring semester, and I was kind of jealous of my friends who had been here for the full year. I said, no, I think I want to spend more time here. So I knew that as soon as I finished college, I wanted to come back to Israel and do an Ulpan and try to get a job here. And so that's what I did. As soon as I graduated from Barnard, I came to Israel. I did a Ulpan in Arad, Wujis, and which led to various internships. At that time, I thought I wanted to be a journalist still. And at a certain point, I did various things while I was here. Aside from working in journalism, I worked in the Rama office, and I was like a pilgrimage group leader and a seminar group leader. And then I came back and went to grad school at Columbia. And as soon as I finished, I knew I wanted to be back in Israel. So I made Aliyah in 95. And yeah, so it's been, almost 27 years. And at first I was in Jerusalem, and then we've been in Modi'in for almost 24 years. Pesach, it'll be 24 years. And, but so I've been in writing for a long time, as you've heard, journalism. And then in my career here, I've done a lot of business writing, but I didn't think I was a creative writer. I didn't think I was a fiction writer at all, until about 14 years ago. I was kind of looking around for something to do, a new like hobby to take up, even though I had 3 small kids at the time. But I was looking for something, to do for myself. And I was in the park across the street from my house, and I was talking to a friend, and I was like, I don't know, should I take an art class? What should I do? And she said, oh, well, so-and-so takes a creative writing class. So-and-so being a mutual friend of ours. And as soon as she said that, I was like, that's it. That's what I want to do. I want to try my hand at writing fiction. And I don't know why I hadn't thought of it myself, because I was always a very big reader. I think my first career aspiration when I was a really little kid was to be a librarian. And I practically ran home from the park and started looking up where can I, take a creative writing class in Israel. And so I found a woman in Jerusalem who was teaching from her home. And so I started with her, and then one thing led to another. And as soon as I started, wow, I can't believe that I was 38 at the time. I can't believe I've spent all my 38 years not writing fiction, because I love it so much. So as soon as I started, I'm like, this is this is here to stay. I want to keep doing this.
So how did you start with Jeremiah and finding that character and
Right.
start on that journey?
Sure. So that first creative writing teacher I had in Jerusalem would give us a prompt every week. Come around Shavuot, it would be something about revelation and whatever it was. I still remember the first prompt she gave me, write something about a secret. And we'd have to come in every week with up to 4 pages, double spaced. It could be a short story or a poem or a memoir, whatever you wanted. And that was a really great place to start my writing journey. And then I moved on to a different teacher. And when I met him, I said, okay, what's the prompt? He said, no, I don't believe in prompts. And I said, no, really, I do much better when I have a prompt. Can you please give me a prompt? So we went back and forth on this for a little while. And eventually he gave me he agreed. And the prompt was, write a story about someone who is definitely not you, but who does something that you're interested in. And this interest could be a hobby, it could be a career. You don't necessarily need to know a lot about this interest, but you have to be curious about it. So I went home and I wrote a story about a Black woman, so definitely not me, who was a single parent, and she has her own landscape architect business, which I don't know anything about. I like to putter around in my garden a little bit. But I was curious about it. So I wrote the story, and I even did a little research on it. I sent my mother to the local nursery in Connecticut and said, like, would you plant these trees in this season? Is this the right, did I get it right? And, just to validate my research. And I brought the story back in, and my teacher really loved it. And he took me aside after class and said, he said the words that every aspiring writer wants to hear. He said, you've got what it takes. Keep going with this. You're a real writer. Keep on with your writing. I'm like, wow. So I took the same prompt because since I liked it so much, and wrote a new story. This time I made the main character an 82-year-old man named Jeremiah. And I had he takes up baking in the story. So I made him a little closer to home this time because I made him a Jewish man, and baking is something I like to do in my free time. And when I finished writing that story, which is called Mixmaster, I was really intrigued by the character of Jeremiah. And I decided I wanted to write a whole book about him. I had just, I I had just read Olive Kittredge, which probably many of you have read as well, by Elizabeth Strout, and I love that collection. And with every story, you kind of see another layer of Olive revealed. And that was my model the whole time. I was like, I want to write something like Olive Kittredge, with this each story, telling you something new about the character. So that's how I got to Jeremiah.
So we'll get to the last story, but going back, because Purim is coming in a couple of days. The first story in the book is about Jeremiah as a young boy in his Purim costume as a shochet. So can you tell us a little bit about what the inspiration was that got you to that story?
Yeah, that's an easy one, because my great grandfather was a kosher butcher, and my father, when he was 9 years old, was dressed up as a shochet for Purim, and he carried around a live chicken in Road of Shalom in Bridgeport. And my grandmother borrowed the chicken from somewhere. And although in my story, I have Jeremiah carrying around a fake knife, but in the real story, my dad actually carried on a real knife, which I don't think would fly today. And I didn't even put it in my story. I should say that the personality of Jeremiah and my father are not at all similar. It was just, I borrowed the costume from my dad. So.
That's a pretty good costume, actually. I
Yeah,
like that one.
yeah. He won one of the costume contests. And in fact, we found the shul put out like a yearbook every year, and we found the year that he had that costume, and there's a picture of him and the other costume winners. It's on my website. You can see, if you zoom in, you can see the chicken.
So I guess, so we start at the beginning of the book with him as a young child, and the relationships between him and his parents. And I guess I sort of thought then that it would just go in that chronological order and he would grow up. So what made you decide to vary the chapters and jump around with ages and time span?
My original idea was to go in reverse chronological order, because that first story I wrote is when he's 82, and it is the last story chronologically speaking in the book. But then I realized that didn't work, and I also didn't want to go in straight chronological order, because even though that first story with Purim, he's 11, I think there's an earlier story chronologically, which you get to later on in the book. Right. But that's really more of his brother's story. Lenny, his older brother, is the main character in that story. And so I wanted Jeremiah to be, to be a major character in the beginning. It took me a long time to figure out the right order for the stories. I had like 6 different possible orders of stories. What helped me crack it is one of my writing teachers said, "Oh, well, think of it in third, like a play, act 1, act 2, act 3. And you have, so there, for the people who haven't read the book, there's 13 stories in the book. 8 of them are told from Jeremiah's perspective, and 5 are from his other family members' perspectives. 1 from his wife, 1 his mother, his brother, his son, and his daughter. Only his father didn't get his own story, but I'm rectifying that now. And so you need to balance in each act, Jeremiah as a young man, as a kid, as an older man, along with the different points of view. So once I had that idea of, okay, let's try to balance each third of the book. Then I also read this great essay about how to structure story collections, and the author of the essay gave maybe 10 or 12 different ways to do it. And the one that stuck with me was to find a common thread, through the stories. And the thread could be the same character, it could be a theme, it could be the setting. So I was able to, and because it's all about one guy and his family, the characters were repeating often, but I was able to find other threads to figure out the way It's the ultimate order of the stories.
So, well, let's start right at the top. Jeremiah's name. Was there a significance to his name?
This is a question I get all the time, and I wish I had a better answer to it. But the real story is that the summer before I wrote the story, I was working at Camp Vermont in New England. I was a Yoetzet, which is a parent liaison. I think I was working with Danny that summer, your daughter. And we had so I was the Yoetzet for the youngest two Eidot. So I was dealing with a lot of homesick kids. And there was one boy who was very homesick named Jeremiah, and he did not make it through the whole summer. So that name just popped into my head when I was writing the story. Although I then did go back and read parts of the original book of Jeremiah, and I brought in a few elements from there into the book. But most people have not figured out what they are. Only one woman and I did a book club with the Barnard Book Club of Jerusalem in the last spring, and one woman had found, figured out what it was. But even my husband, who's, as you can see, he's
Right, a scholar here.
A scholar,
So
yes.
So do you want to give us a clue or give us some tips of
the parts of Jeremiah? Yeah, there's first of all, the prophet Jeremiah is worried that he's going to be a laughingstock. And in one of the stories called Emeritus, when Jeremiah feels like he's being pushed out by his younger colleagues, he's worried that he's a laughingstock. And there's another story that takes place at the tail end of the Vietnam War that is, they're in a press conference at the State Department, and they kind of get into a protest. And Jeremiah yells something like, what happened to Kissinger's peace is at hand statement, which is a statement that Kissinger actually made before the 72 election. Peace, he promised, but there's no peace. And that's also a direct quote from the original book of Jeremiah. Yeah.
Very interesting. So when you are writing one of these stories, how do you write? Do you write that the ending when you start the story, or do you start writing an idea and then it's sort of the characters sort of speak to you and develop themselves? What's that process like?
I think they do speak to me a little bit. I definitely don't outline ahead of time, certainly not for a short story. And even in the novel draft I tried outlining and it didn't really work for me. I ended up diverging from the outline so much that it didn't even make sense to look at it. But I start with a scene or a hook in history. A lot of the stories center around like an actual historical event, or even if it's not a historical event, like there's a baseball game in one of the stories that the World Series in 1932 took place on Rosh Hashanah. So like there's I don't know if that's a historical event, but it's something that actually happened. And I like to create the characters' reactions sometimes to that. Sometimes it's I'll tell you one funny story or interesting way I got to this story is there was one story that I wrote and ended up throwing out completely. It's not in the collection. For whatever reason, I decided it wasn't working, and I wanted to write a new story. And that original story took place in 1964 in the Berkshires, where Jeremiah has just moved his family up from Washington, D.C. up to the Berkshires, his young family. And so the only things I knew I wanted to keep the same were the year and the location. So 1964 Berkshires. I was like, well, what was happening in the summer of 1964? I opened up Google. I was doing this in the summer of 2014. I open up Google, type in 1964. And the first thing that comes up is Freedom Summer. And I see the pictures of the 3 missing civil rights workers who were, eventually found murdered. And we had just had that horrible summer in Israel where the 3 boys were kidnapped and killed, and the posters were so similar. I was, oh my God, I have to write about this. That was the beginning of that story. That's now called Tough Day for LBJ.
Right. So you do write about a number of different historical events in the stories. How did you decide? So you're like just looking and thinking about an event that you're interested in, or they're all like you're trying to find something that connects to where he would be in his life?
Yeah. So Jeremiah, as an adult, is a professor of political science, so he's very aware of what's going on. But yeah, sometimes things just happen by chance, or like I can tell you the order of the first 3 stories I wrote. The first one I mentioned is Mixed Master, which is when he's 82 and he takes up baking. Then there's a story that takes place in Israel. The original version of that story is very different from what is the final version. But Jeremiah goes on a trip to Israel with his wife and his daughter. In the original version, the daughter was not on the trip. And then the third story I wrote, I went way back in time to 1945, when Jeremiah is a soldier in the US Army in World War II. The war in Europe has just ended, but it's still going on in the Pacific. And I did a lot of research for that one on, I put Jeremiah in the Signal Corps because my grandfather was in the Signal Corps.
Yeah.
Even though my grandfather was in the Signal Corps, didn't mean I knew exactly what he did. So I went and I did a lot of research on that. What does it mean to be a soldier? What would he have been doing after D-Day in France and Belgium? What were the kinds? And so I did a lot of research for that, and I love the research part. My mom, who usually attends the Women's League reads, but she's at a wedding now, she's a former American history teacher. So I think I got my love of American history from her. So sometimes I would happen on events. The one I'm writing, I mentioned that I'm writing a few news stories that Abe, Jeremiah's father, is going to get his own story. And so I decided to set that one on July 4th, 1976, which I'm sure many of you remember, not just the bicentennial, but it was also the Entebbe. So like, I don't know, I had in my mind something about Entebbe that I wanted to write about it. So it depends on the story, and sometimes, by the way, I find out after the fact there's a connection. The one I mentioned that it takes place during Freedom Summer, I sent my parents a draft of the story, and my mother said, "Oh, well, your uncle was down there. He was in Mississippi volunteering." I'm like, I had no idea. So then I went and I interviewed my uncle, and I think probably only one line of that whole interview made it into the final story. But now I have 4-page notes of his experience during that summer.
Right. So you continue to write Jeremiah's stories. Did the Black women from your first story ever come back to you and want to tell more stories?
No, she hasn't actually, but that story was published, which I was very happy about. No, because the next story I wrote was Jeremiah, and then he kind of took hold of me, and I thought I was done with him, by the way. When the book came out, my cousin, one of my book events, so the book came out pre-pandemic, so I got in a few in-person events. My cousin asked me in one of these events, like, are you done with Jeremiah? Are we going to see more of him? Like, no, I'm done with him. And then R.L. Mazies, who I know was at a Women's League Read event a few months ago, sent me this thing, this maybe 6 months after my book came out. She said, "Oh, NPR is looking for stories about Hanukkah. I'm sure you have a Hanukkah story." I'm like, "Actually, I don't have a Hanukkah story." And I took that as a prompt, and I wrote a new Jeremiah story that takes place on Hanukkah, which was just published by jewishfiction.net at the beginning of December during Hanukkah this past year. So yeah, so I didn't realize I had more stories in me, but apparently I do.
Or maybe from Molly or Hannah's perspective, do they have more of a story to tell?
There's another new story that I started at the beginning of the pandemic about from Molly's point of view. Not so much with a historical event hooked on it, but dealing with there are some actual historical people in the story. Like she's a big Leonard Bernstein fan, so he's in there. Yeah. They go to Tanglewood,
So what makes Jeremiah become so cantankerous as he ages? He was such a, as a child, he's such a, I guess, I don't know if easygoing is the word, but, wild child. And then he grows into such a cantankerous old man.
He does. Well, I don't want to give away any spoilers for people who haven't read it. But there is one very important event in his life that I kind of attribute the shift in his personality to. It's funny about when you say the cantankerous. I've had people come up to me and say, "Oh, I like the book, but I really didn't love Jeremiah as a character. I didn't like him so much." And then I've had other people come up to me and said, "Oh my God, it's me." So it's there's a synagogue in Chicago that was reading each story for their weekly discussion group, and they told me that every week at the end of the discussion they would take a vote at how much they liked Jeremiah, that story. If he was your neighbor and he need his lawn mowed, would you lend him your lawnmower, or would you help him mow the lawn? That's how they would decide if they liked him or not. That's because there are other stories, even in his later years, that he does, comes to his wife's rescue at certain things. And
right, but he has that short fuse that seems to get him into trouble, and he doesn't seem to learn from story.
Right.
Story.
Probably if he was born today, he'd be diagnosed with ADHD or something like that. Yeah, he's very impulsive.
All right, so you don't want to give us too many.
I don't know. I mean,
I guess I thought also it would have been interesting, and I understand the short story method of leaving, I guess, sort of not a hanging chad, but room for people to think about their own ending. But I guess I was sort of hoping from the first story where he's young and he's so rebellious and his mother's having a really hard time bringing him up, that I would sort of feel at the end of the book sort of a resolution that his mother finally understood him or something like that. And you never really went there, I guess.
That's true. I didn't go there. I think I hinted about it in some of the stories, but I can tell you that in the new stories I'm writing, I do go there a bit more. So they get closer. Yeah, they get.
I sort of wanted to feel, I guess that's what, right, that same feeling of, do you like the character or not? That in the end, I wanted him to be successful and his parents to say, "Oh, see, it all worked out. I knew you'd be successul when you grew up." But
yeah,
you don't really.
They're proud of him. They are proud of him.
Right. Right. So, okay. So, and he also seems to repeat, I think, some of the mistakes his parents made with him. You
Definitely.
want to talk about that?
There's
children.
Yeah. So one of Jeremiah's issues, or one of the reasons he seems like a very rebellious, wild child as a kid, is because his older brother is the obedient, studious one, and his mother is always, gets lots of nachas from him, and from Jeremiah she just gets or in her view, she just gets tsuris. And he feels this very keenly, that like, his brother is the favored child. But then he does the same thing with his own kids. He favors his daughter over his son. His daughter is the one who's kind of growing up in his, follows in his footsteps, even in the same profession. She also becomes a political science professor. And his son is the one that's, he's a disappointment. And it's very transparent also to the kids. They know, So yeah, he repeats some of those same mistakes, as probably we all do, even if we don't want to be repeating the mistakes of our parents. Somehow we do.
Do you relate to Molly at all? Do you did you take up a musical instrument at all now?
I've not taken up a musical instrument, but because she's like a big I guess in my newest story, she's a big Leonard Bernstein fan, but also in the one story that's there's one story that focuses on Molly's music. She's a piano teacher by trade, and in her 60s, she takes up the guitar and the electric guitar. And there was, I think, a line in there. I don't even remember if it made it into the final version of the story, but at one point I had one of her kids saying to her, like, why the electric guitar? Like, you're a big, Carole King fan. And so I started, I start then like went on this whole Carole King, listening, spree. And when I was writing the newer Molly story, like listening to Leonard Bernstein all the time. So it definitely filters back into my own life, or into what I'm doing. I did play the piano, as a kid, but I haven't taken it up again since.
So can you share with us the message that you, or is there a message in the book overall that you were trying to?
Yeah, when I was writing the stories, my goal was just to write, interesting, entertaining stories that would, with compelling characters. And I wasn't thinking about one overall message for the book. But then when the book came out, I did all these interviews, and I would get that question, what's the takeaway that you want everyone, to get from the book? And so I had to think about it. And, so the whole act of writing, it's a revelatory process for me. Sometimes I need to write a whole story to figure out what I think about something. And sometimes I need to write a whole book or so far once, I need to write a whole book to figure out what I think about something. And so I think the message for me is that, as you mentioned, Jeremiah is not always an easy character, and he's probably the most exasperating for his family members, to the people he loves the most, he ends up being the most difficult with. And so the message I'd like people to take away is that even when you're dealing with a very difficult person, and especially when it's a difficult family member, is to try to accept them as best you can with love, because even though he's difficult and they are exasperated by him all the time, there is I hope, comes through an undercurrent of love in the family, from him to his wife, and his wife to him, and him to his kids, and back to him. That basically try to be accepting of the difficult people in your life, and love wins. I guess that's my takeaway.
So then, just looking at like the whole writing process, because you wrote these at different times, I guess there's not like, you can't say it took me 5 years to write this or 10 years to write this book. Would you?
Well, from the first draft of the first story to the last major revision of the last story was about 4.5 years, I would say. The first story that's in the book, the Purim/Pesach story, I must have written 17 different drafts of that, and
Wow.
I sat with it for a long time, and I kept thinking it's done, and I would send it out to literary journals, and I got some nice feedback, but I was not getting it. It wasn't getting accepted. And then And so I kept revising it, and eventually the current ending came to me. And it took about 4 years, but sometimes you just have to sit with something, and then it, pops into your head one day.
Yeah.
And as soon as it pops into my head, I'm like, oh my God, that's the perfect ending for this kid in this story. So that was the last major revision I did of the book, is that the ending of the first story. So 4.5 years to write, and then another 2 or so years to find a publisher, and then another year and a bit before it came out. So it's a long process.
But each of the stories, or just a few of the stories, were published separately. How many of the stories were
10 out of 13 were published separately. Originally, yeah. Which is the advice I got for story collection is try to get them published in literary journals. And once you have about half that are published, then you can start looking for a publisher. So that's what I did.
So a lot of times they talk about the book cover on a book, and I have to say, I didn't really pay attention to the book cover at the beginning, but I was reading some things online, and someone mentioned the picture, which at first I just thought, oh, it's a silhouette, but it actually is a silhouette of him aging. So it's a really nice, like, poignant cover. Actually, the picture has a lot of meaning of him going from a young boy to an aging man. Were you involved in the cover? Because a lot of times the authors aren't, I know.
Yeah, I was. With a small publisher, you're involved in everything. It took us a long time to figure out what the right cover would be, and it wasn't my idea or the publisher's idea. He was like, you need to come up with an abiding image for your book. I'm like, well, it's very hard. It covers the guy's whole life, and at different points of his life, and what can the abiding image be? And there's some like brownies is in a couple stories. I'm like, we have a picture of Brownie on the cover. And it was an intern for him that figured it out. This intern had she'd proofread the book at the beginning, over the summer, and then she came to work for him full time in like December, and she said, and she had been an art major, and she had the idea for this silhouettes. I still it was very stressful coming up with the cover. I was and the colors and the fonts, and I mean, there was one day and we had to make a decision, and I was on a bus back from Tel Aviv, and they're sending me a few different options of different colors, and I had the bus got into the mall in Modi'in, and there was 15 minutes before the mall closed, and I ran to this printing place, and I'm like, can you please print these in color? And then I ran to Steinmatzky's, the bookstore in the mall. I'm like, what do you think of these? I mean, I had the one I liked the best, and luckily the two people in Steinmatzky's agreed with me, and that's what we went with.
That's how you went.
Yeah. But I was like a lunatic running around the mall with these pictures.
So you have alluded a few times to things that you are writing now. Do you have something new coming out that we can be looking forward to or watching for?
Yeah, so I mentioned the first new Jeremiah story that is not in the book was published in December by jewishfiction.net. And I have another 3 stories I'm working on, and an idea for a 4th and maybe a 5th. So maybe there'll be a companion volume. I also have this draft of a novel that I'm not sure what I'm going to do with. I made it about 2/3 of the way through a 3rd draft. It has nothing to do with Jeremiah. It takes place in Israel. I'm not sure how I feel about the characters though, and I have to make a decision. Do I want to go back into them? But in the meantime, I'm having fun with the new Jeremiah stories. And sometimes I write essays and other flash fiction stories, and I do have a flash fiction story coming out in a few months. Totally unrelated to anything we've been talking about.
What does flash fiction mean?
Oh, thanks. Flash fiction is usually a story that is under 1,000 words. Sometimes there's like microfiction, which is under 100 words. I'm not so into that. But flash fiction, you can get a nice story in under 1,000 words.
So do you sit down every day and write for a certain amount of time, no matter what, or do you wait until you have an idea and then you sit down and
No, I try to get up. I try to write every morning, whether or not I have an idea. And I used to write a lot in cafes and on the train, because for the 5 years before the pandemic, I was taking the train into Tel Aviv every day for work. So that was like a good block of 35, 40-minute time that I would try not to talk to anybody. Of course, I would see people I knew on the train, like, please don't talk to me. So with the pandemic, when I was not taking the train anymore and not going to cafes, it was a little harder to write from home. But and my kids aren't little anymore, but still just find it hard to write with people around. And as you can see, I share an office with my husband, so definitely can't write when he's in the room. So to do this, I have to get up really early and write. And so I gave myself a very moderate goal of like try to get at least 300 words a day, and sometimes that's just revising of something I already wrote, but I do try to write every day except for Shabbat. my day of rest. Yeah.
Susan, do we have any questions in the questions or in the chat? You're muted. You're muted, Susan, you're muted.
I haven't looked that corner. Chat is nothing.
Okay, anybody have any questions that they'd like to add in? Just raise your hands if we haven't, typed them in the chat. And I'll just keep.
Louise, please unmute.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you, and from another Barnard graduate, so that when you give her biography at the beginning, you said about, she went to Columbia, but you didn't say she went to Barnard. So I want to re-emphasize that, and thank you. That's all.
Yeah, it's having grown up in New York and having gone to JTS as a high schooler in Prosdor. I walked by both campuses up Broadway, so I'm well aware of it, but I didn't specify, and I apologize. There is a comment from Rachel Gould, who is physically in Germany, and she's wondering why we assume that all the books in that office belong to her husband when they could possibly also belong to Julie, or they could be a shared library. So Julie, do you want to explain?
Sure.
You want to claim a shelf?
Well, I would, I'm a little embarrassed to show you my actual, I have a few books, a few shelves here, but mostly my novels are downstairs. But yes, it is, these are my husband's books. My husband, some of you might know him. Well, certainly I see my sister. I didn't see you on the call till now. Hi, Lee. And other familiar faces who know my husband is Josh Culp. He does the Daf Shui for USCJ, and he did the Mishnah Yomi, I think. And he's the co-Rosh Yeshiva of the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. So these are definitely his, but yes, he has plenty of female colleagues who would have libraries like this.
Okay, another comment. I'm now getting some comments in the chat since it's open. Claire Zimmers remembers reading your book in the past. She's can't wait to reread it. And now that she's heard the interview, she feels it's much more inspiring and greater. She'll derive greater meaning in rereading your book. Louise Sherby has a very interesting question. Her question is, you write all these different stories seemingly at the same time from her perspective, her grasp of our interview. How do you keep the storyline straight, or do things expand into another story from the original idea?
That's a great question. Thanks, Louise. Well, I'm writing one story at a time, but sometimes they do end up splitting into two. There's 2 stories in the book that I think originally started as one story, and they split into 2. One is called The Book of Jeremiah, the title story, which takes place in 2006, and the other one is Emeritus, which takes place a few years before that, I think. But yeah, so sometimes one thing leads to another, and I'll, get the idea to write a new story based on, one little nugget of a line. For example, this new story that I just had published that takes place over Hanukkah. It takes place in Jeremiah goes on a road trip with his son-in-law and his grandson to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Now, in the original book, there's one line in there, in I think the Book of Jeremiah's story, where he mentions that he had taken his grandson to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and how his grandson had to read every single sign in every single room, which is actually based on a true story, where because my husband took my son and my father and his father, it was like 4 people on this road trip to Cooperstown, and my son was very baseball obsessed at the time, and he read every single sign in every single room. So anyway, I took that one little line in that one story, and then I decided to make a new story of it. And yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yes, and there was another.
I want to ask a clarifying question. So Julie, you were saying that your son, when he was on this trip with his father and your husband's father and your father, there's these 4 men. So your son was really the inspiration or led to this idea of being sign reading and leading to some stories. Okay.
Yes, definitely. My kid, there's little bits of my kids in a lot of the stories, and I can kind of, I mentioned I knew the order of the first 3 stories I wrote, but then I don't remember the order that I wrote them. But if I really want to think about it, I can think back to the ages of my kids. Like there's one story where Jeremiah's daughter is like 3 or 4, and she's likes to sing all the time. So my daughter, who's now 13, is very musical and likes to sing all the time. So she was probably around 3 or 4 when I wrote that story. Lots of little bits of family lore and things
that come into it. So someone asks if you have a secondary character in the book that's your favorite, but that's assuming that Jeremiah is your favorite. Who is your favorite character? And
I think Jeremiah is my favorite. I mean, he's definitely the most complex. And do I have a secondary character? That's a good question. Hold on, I'm going to look for a second. That's a question from my sister, thankfully. Let me think. I think Ricky, Jeremiah's mother. She's only in 1.5 stories. She's in 2 stories, but really majorly in 1. I like her a lot too, even though she's also a complex character. Parts of her, not her personality, but the things surrounding her kitchen and her Pesach preparation. It's very similar to my grandmother's kitchen and Pesach preparation. So it was, fun for me to kind of re-enter the world of my grandparents when I was writing that story.
You have to feel for her as a frazzled mother, worried that her child is not going to be the successful person that he needs to be as an adult. I guess a lot of us go through similar. worrying about our children. And Diane writes that she has a totally different idea about what the book was about. Do others say they thought the book was more of a biblical story rather than a story of modern relationships?
Yeah. I do get that from a few people, or they assume it's going to be something biblical, and then they're surprised. One funny thing, on Amazon, they put your book in certain categories. You can see, where you ranked. And for some reason, mine was originally was listed under like women's domestic life fiction. I'm like, okay, I am a woman writer, but the main character is a man. Why, so I asked the publisher, can you try to get it under Jewish literature or something like that? And he did get it in that category, but the one that I'm always like the highest ranked on is religious short stories. Now, they're not religious, like the characters are not very religious. And so when you go into that category on Amazon, you see a lot of like Christian short stories, and then my book comes up. But so yeah, so a few people do think that maybe it's biblical, but then they start reading.
I guess it's just the title, really. That is the.
Yeah.
So and we have on this in Women's League Reads, we have discussed, being a Jewish writer, or just being a writer that happens to be Jewish. And I guess I would think from this book that it has wide appeal, because I don't think the stories are very, they refer to a Jewish holiday or talk about, how you prep for Passover, but actually a lot of them really don't have really a Jewish content. You're dealing with Vietnam War and other historical things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely do consider myself a Jewish writer. But yeah, I'm certainly not dealing with anything like theology or spirituality in the stories. And I'm glad. I want them to be universal. Like, I wasn't writing for specifically a Jewish audience when I wrote the stories. And I think I mentioned this to you last week when we were talking, but one of the guys who wrote the blurb on the back of my book, he's like a guy from Arkansas and not Jewish. And he wrote something like, I'll just read the last line. Reading these wise and moving stories, you'll feel like a long lost relative who's returned home just in time for the family reunion. I'm like, wow, if he feels like it could be a member of his family, then I've, hopefully I've hit on something that other people can relate to, Jew or non-Jew.
Right. So if there aren't any other questions, I would say thank you very much for joining us. This has been wonderful. Is there any last words you'd like to add? I think we will share your website information, and because I will say there's a brownie recipe on there, but it doesn't contain any nefarious ingredients. I was disappointed to see, but you do some recipes and other things on your website. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about that, and we'll share all that information and how we can read the Hanukkah story about Jeremiah also on.
Sure.
Yeah, and I believe, Julie, you mentioned to us that in Modi'in you started this opportunity for authors to share, and I think you sent us already the link. So when I finalize these notes that I've been scrolling, I'll put all that information in, so especially our Israeli members can be aware of it, as well as, and hopefully with the Green Pass. Hopefully I read this correctly, that in Israel, the Green Pass is no longer being required. And people will probably start having more events face-to-face. I think here in the United States, things like that are happening as well. So hopefully we are past the worst of the coronavirus. And so Julie has put in the chat box a link to her literary Modi'in initiative. And I think that's, it's reaching out and helping other authors get recognition and an audience for their writing, which I think everybody is eager to benefit from here.
Can I just say, I'll just explain what it is. It's an author series that I started before the pandemic as an in-person series, but now we switched to being totally virtual, and once a month, and the next one is next Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Every month I bring 3 different authors with some Jewish content in their books, mostly fiction, but occasionally memoir writers as well, or poetry. And it's open to everybody. It's free. You hear from 3 different authors. Each one of them speaks for about 15 minutes. And next Sunday, we have Derek Miller, whose book, How to Find Your Way in the Dark, just won the American Jewish Library's Fiction Award like 2 days ago. It's an excellent book. Ben Sharovsky, whose short story collection, he's an Israeli-Australian writer from Sydney. And he has a story collection, and Pamela Braun Cohen, who wrote a memoir called Hidden Heroes. She was like on the front lines of the Soviet Jewry movement. And she's based in Jerusalem and Chicago. So that's just coming next week. But one other thing I want to say is that I love meeting with book clubs. So all of you are in different shoals and sisterhood book clubs, I'm sure. I would love to meet with more book clubs. So anyone that would like, I'd be happy to speak to their book club. And my publisher is very happy to arrange like a group discounts. If there's somewhere you can ship a bunch of books to for this, the same address, which obviously didn't work for a women's league type of event, but for a synagogue or sisterhood book club, that's definitely possible. He's happy to give big discounts. And the last thing I'll say is that I have a monthly author newsletter where I give 3 or 4 book recommendations a month, any writing news. There's always announcements of the Literary Modi'in events, a recipe in every newsletter, a story that I found compelling that I, not necessarily one of my stories, but something that I found interesting and things like that. So, and I'll put that in the chat also if anybody wants to subscribe to the newsletter. Oh, and I always have pictures of like the wildflowers in Israel as well.
Okay, that's really nice. So before we close, I'm going to mention that on June, I don't know if people can really see this, but this is my public library copy that I got, historical fiction, Zhanna, Zhanna, Slor, Slor, is our author. She lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The title of this historical fiction is At the End of the World, Turn Left. And she has agreed to meet with us on June 2nd, which is a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. So that is our next event. And Merle and I are still working out what we're doing for the coming calendar year. As you can understand, Merle is not in her home right now. She's in New Jersey dealing with family matters. And I still am focused on teaching more than I should, but that's something I've agreed to do since August, and it will come to a close at the end of May. So maybe I'll have more time to really devote to this in a more prompt manner. So anyway, thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Julie. This was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Merle and Susan. This was great. Thanks to everybody for coming, especially the family friends. It's great to see
nice of you to have all your family friends on.
And I wanted to just throw in, representing Israel here and the Masorti Women's Study Days and my wonderful connection with Women's League Reads, that the Small World Story, which came up here on that Rachel Gould, who is on my planning committee, usually in Yokneam, but who's living now in Germany, is actually someone that Julie and her sister know. And I can't believe that this happened in this crazy thing that Julie's sister and Rachel Gould were at college together. It's unbelievable.
It's a small world, a small conservative Jewish world.
Right.
Okay. And
So I thank all of you for making the effort also to encourage the inclusion of Israeli Jewish women, particularly in this Women's League Read group. And I know we've had a few in the past, and I hope that it will continue and that we can continue to expand our group to be involved in coming and attending. Thank you very, very much.
with pleasure,
Thank you.
Diane.
Thank you.
Merle and I are trying very hard to select one Israeli writer every year.
Yep,
That's
we
our
will.
goal. So we will hopefully continue with that. And so the last thing I want to say is my closing wish for all. May we all find meaning and inspiration as we celebrate Purim this coming week, prepare and celebrate Passover with family and friends and community, and count the Omer and celebrate Shavuot, because the next time we'll meet virtually will be after all those Chagim, all those holidays. So hopefully we find inspiration despite the tragedy we have to hear about on a daily basis, unfortunately. May we be lifted when our hearts are heavy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Debbie, did you want to say anything in closing?
I want to assure Diane that we're going to continue the relationship that we have with our Kehilot in Israel. Never question, Diane. Our Women's League, organization is built on the foundation of our continuing relationship with Israel and our Israeli sisters. So we hope that you'll be able to gather more of them to join us for all of our programs and not just Women's League Reads. I want to thank everyone for spending their Sunday afternoon with us. And Julie, I just chatted you up that we've actually met. I belong to Shirat Hayam in Ventnor. And it's wonderful, wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shalom, everyone.
Shalom.